Imagine a weapon so heavy that only 1 in 1,000 warriors could even lift it, yet it could shatter castle gates, crush cavalry charges, and turn the tide of entire wars with a single swing. Now imagine that weapon wasn't just metal and wood. It was a statement of dominance, a psychological weapon that made enemies flee before the first blow ever landed. But the world of ancient warfare holds far more than the swords and spears you see in movies. Hidden in the shadows of history are weapons so massive, so brutally effective, that they rewrote the rules of combat. These weren't tools for the average soldier. These were instruments of devastation, wielded by warriors who trained their entire lives for the honor and the burden of carrying them into battle. Consider this: archaeologists have unearthed war hammers that weighed as much as a small child, yet bore the marks of repeated use in combat. Battle axes with blades so large they could cleave through armor, bone, and shield in a single strike. Pole arms that stretched over 20 feet long, designed not just to kill, but to terrify entire formations of enemy troops. These weapons didn't just end lives, they ended battles. Each of these weapons is steeped in mystery, carved into history by the blood of forgotten warriors and the fall of mighty empires. They were the ultimate expression of raw power, the kind that made kings and generals rethink their entire battle strategies. Today, we'll uncover 6 of the most devastating heavy weapons ever forged, each one more brutal than the last. And the first one? It was considered so dangerous that some kingdoms tried to ban it entirely. Weapon 1. The Zweihander, the Giant's Blade. Our journey begins with a weapon that sounds like pure fantasy. A sword so enormous that it required both hands, superhuman strength, and years of specialized training just to use effectively. The Zweihander. In German, it literally means two-hander, but that name doesn't do it justice. We're talking about a blade that often measured over 6 feet in length, taller than most of the men who faced it. Some examples weighed up to 15 pounds, and the longest recorded Zweihander stretched an incredible 7 feet, 2 inches. But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't ceremonial weapons. They saw brutal, repeated combat. And the men who wielded them? They were paid double the wages of regular soldiers. These elite warriors were called Doppelsoldner, literally double pay men. And they earned every coin. Their role on the battlefield was terrifyingly specific. They were pike killers. During the 15th and 16th centuries, European battlefields were dominated by massive formations of pikemen, soldiers wielding 15 to 20-foot long spears in tight ranks that could stop cavalry charges and infantry assaults alike. These pike squares were nearly invincible. Nearly. The Doppelsoldner would charge directly into these pike formations, a suicidal mission for any normal soldier. But with their massive Zweihanders, they would swing in wide, devastating arcs, literally chopping the enemy pikes in half. Imagine the scene. A wall of spears bristling like a porcupine. Then suddenly a gap tears open as a giant blade scythes through wooden shafts like grass. But there's a detail about the Zweihander's design that reveals just how these warriors fought, and it's hidden in plain sight on the blade itself. The sword featured something called a ricasso, a blunted section of the blade just above the crossguard, often wrapped in leather. Why? Because in the chaos of battle, Doppelsoldner would sometimes grip the blade itself with their second hand, using the sword more like a lever or polearm for greater control and power. Battle damage on recovered swords shows scoring and impact marks on these ricasso sections, proving these warriors were literally grabbing their own blades mid-combat. The psychological impact was immense. Imagine standing in a pike formation, shoulder to shoulder with your comrades, feeling relatively safe behind your wall of spears. Then you see a warrior, larger than life, wielding a blade that looks like it belongs to a giant, charging directly at you. The sound alone as that blade cuts through the air would be terrifying. But here's what most people don't know about how these weapons were actually used in the critical first moments of battle. The Doppelsoldner didn't just swing wildly. They were trained in a specific German martial art called Fechten, and their techniques were surprisingly sophisticated. Contemporary fencing manuals show that they used the Zweihander's length and weight to maintain distance, keeping multiple enemies at bay with sweeping figure-8 patterns. One warrior could hold off 5 or 6 regular soldiers simply through the weapon's reach and the threat of its devastating power. Historical records from the Battle of Kappel in 1531 describe Zweihander-wielding Swiss mercenaries creating killing circles around themselves, areas of approximately 15 feet in diameter where no enemy could safely enter. Soldiers who attempted to rush these warriors were cut down mid-charge. Those who hesitated were picked off with sudden lunges, the massive sword driven forward like a spear. But the weapon had a fatal weakness that would eventually lead to its decline, and it wasn't what you'd think. It wasn't the weight, though fatigue was certainly a factor. It wasn't the difficulty of wielding it, though that was considerable. The problem was tactical evolution. As firearms became more prevalent on European battlefields, the close-quarters melee where the Zweihander excelled became less common. You can't cut through musket balls, and getting close enough to engage pike formations meant exposing yourself to devastating gunfire. By the mid-1600s, the Zweihander had largely disappeared from active military service. But its legend lived on. Museums across Europe display these magnificent weapons, and many bear battle scars, notches, dents, and scratches that tell stories of desperate combat. One particular Zweihander in the German Historical Museum in Berlin shows something remarkable: repair work. The blade had been damaged in combat, then carefully welded and reinforced, suggesting its wielder valued it enough to have it repaired rather than replaced. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a warrior's identity. Yet as impressive as the Zweihander was, it pales in comparison to the next weapon on our list, one that combined the mass of a sledgehammer with the precision of an assassin's tool, and was specifically designed to kill one type of enemy: armored knights. Weapon 2, the bec de Corbin, the raven's beak. The late medieval period presented warriors with a problem. Armor had become too good. By the 14th and 15th centuries, European nobility wore full-plate armor, masterfully crafted steel that could turn aside swords, deflect arrows, and withstand most conventional weapons. Knights encased in this armor were mobile fortresses, nearly invincible on the battlefield. Armies needed a solution. They needed something that could defeat metal without trying to cut through it. Enter the bec de Corbin. In French, it means raven's beak, and once you see it, you'll understand why. This wasn't a sword. It wasn't an axe. It was something far more sinister, a specialized polearm designed with surgical precision to kill armored opponents. Picture a weapon standing 6 to 8 feet tall, topped with a combination of brutal implements. A hammer face on one side, a curved spike like a bird's beak on the other, and often a spear point on top. Each component served a specific, lethal purpose, and the knights who faced it learned to fear that distinctive silhouette. The hammer face could deliver concussive force that would stun or even kill an armored opponent without penetrating the armor itself. Medieval plate armor, while incredibly protective, had a fatal flaw: it transmitted impact. A solid strike from the bec de Corbin's hammer could cause internal injuries, broken bones, or unconsciousness even through perfect armor. Historical medical records from medieval battles describe knights dying from no visible wounds, internal trauma caused by blunt force weapons like this. But the raven's beak itself, that curved spike, was the true innovation, and its design reveals a dark understanding of medieval armor's weak points. Plate armor, despite covering most of the body, had gaps. It had to, otherwise knights couldn't move. Behind the knee, at the elbow, under the arm, at the throat. These joints were protected by mail or leather, not plate. The bec de Corbin's curved spike was designed to hook into these gaps. Imagine the technique. A foot soldier faces an armored knight. Striking the armor directly would be useless. Instead, he uses the weapon's reach to keep distance. Then when the knight closes in or falls, he hooks the beak behind the knight's knee, jerks him off balance, and brings him down. Once down, that same beak pierces through the gaps in the armor, under the arm, through the visor, into the throat. Contemporary accounts from the 100 Years' War describe French knights, the pinnacle of medieval military prowess, being pulled from their horses and dispatched by common foot soldiers armed with these weapons. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 saw thousands of armored French nobles defeated by English and Welsh troops using polearms very similar to the bec de Corbin. But there's an even darker aspect to this weapon's use that chronicles from the period reluctantly reveal. The bec de Corbin became the preferred weapon for executing captured nobles. Medieval warfare operated on a ransom system. Captured knights were worth more alive than dead, as they could be ransomed back to their families for substantial sums. But sometimes, examples needed to be made. Sometimes, mercy wasn't profitable. The weapon was efficient for execution because it could pierce armor at specific points. Records from the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396 describe thousands of captured French and Hungarian knights executed by Ottoman forces. While swords were used in some cases, polearms like the bec de Corbin were preferred because they could dispatch armored prisoners quickly without the need to remove their armor first. This wasn't just about efficiency, it was about terror. The weapon that made knights vulnerable in battle made them equally vulnerable in defeat. French military manuscripts from the period, particularly the writings of Christine de Pizan, one of the medieval era's few female military theorists, discuss training with hooked polearms and emphasize techniques for attacking armored opponents. Her instructions are surprisingly specific. Aim for joints, use the hook to pull opponents off balance, use the hammer to stun, use the spike to finish. Archaeological evidence supports these brutal tactics. Mass graves from medieval battlefields show skeletal remains with specific trauma patterns. Puncture wounds in areas that would have been armor gaps, blunt force trauma to the head and torso consistent with hammer weapons, and damage to knee and elbow bones suggesting opponents were targeted at their joints. But before moving on, I would like to ask you for something. If you like these documentaries and want to support me, please consider subscribing. It's free. The Bec de Corbin represented a philosophical shift in medieval warfare. The age of individual knightly valor was ending, replaced by professional soldiers with specialized weapons designed to kill efficiently. The Romantic era of chivalry couldn't withstand the cold pragmatism of weapons designed specifically to defeat it. Yet for all its effectiveness against armor, the Bec de Corbin still required considerable skill and strength to use properly. The next weapon on our list required neither. It just required rage, desperation, and the willingness to get closer to your enemy than any sane person would dare, close enough to smell their fear. Weapon 3. The flail, chaos on a chain. Most of the weapons we've discussed so far were products of sophisticated military engineering, designed by professionals for specific tactical purposes. The flail is different. The flail is primal. At its core, the military flail consisted of a handle, a chain, and a weighted head, often spiked. Simple, brutal, and absolutely terrifying to face in combat. Because unlike a sword or axe, you couldn't predict where it would strike next. The weapon's unpredictability was its greatest advantage. When a warrior swung a flail, the chained head would arc and bend in ways that defied typical combat blocking techniques. You could raise your shield to protect yourself, and the flail head would simply curve around it, striking you from an unexpected angle. This made traditional defensive training nearly useless. But here's what makes the flail truly fascinating. Historians have debated for decades whether it was even a real battlefield weapon at all. Medieval artwork and manuscripts frequently depict flails, but actual archaeological evidence is surprisingly scarce. Unlike swords, axes, and polearms, which are found in abundance at battle sites and in museum collections, genuine medieval military flails are rare. This has led some historians to argue that the flail was primarily a symbolic or ceremonial weapon, or perhaps even a later Romantic invention. However, recent discoveries have changed that narrative entirely. In 2014, archaeologists excavating a medieval castle in Austria uncovered a well-preserved military flail dating to the early 14th century. The weapon showed clear signs of combat use, dents, blood residue in the crevices of its spiked ball, and stress marks on the chain consistent with repeated high-force impacts. This wasn't a ceremonial piece. This was a weapon that had seen real battle. Contemporary written accounts, while less common than for other weapons, do exist. A Hussite war chronicle from the 1420s describes Bohemian rebels using flails, modified agricultural tools, against armored German knights with devastating effectiveness. The Hussites, religious reformers fighting the Holy Roman Empire, couldn't afford sophisticated weapons, so they improvised. And here's where the flail's design becomes darkly ingenious. The chain created a whip-like effect that could generate tremendous impact force at the moment of contact. Physics tests conducted on replica medieval flails have shown that the chained head can accelerate to speeds significantly higher than the handle's swing speed, essentially creating a force multiplier. When that spiked ball makes contact with armor, flesh, or bone, it delivers impact equivalent to a much heavier weapon. Medieval physicians' accounts describe specific injuries consistent with flail weapons: crushed skull fragments forming distinctive star-shaped fracture patterns, broken bones with multiple impact points, and penetrating wounds from spikes that had entered at oblique angles impossible for rigid weapons. But the weapon had a darker purpose than just combat effectiveness. It was a weapon of terror. Imagine facing an opponent wielding a flail in close combat. You can't predict the weapon's path. You can't effectively block it. And the visual of a spiked ball swinging in erratic circles is psychologically unsettling in a way that a sword isn't. Historical accounts describe soldiers breaking formation and fleeing at the sight of flail-wielding opponents, even before actual combat began. The Hussite Wars provide the most detailed accounts of military flail use. The Hussites developed specific tactics around their improvised weapons, including the flail. They would form tight defensive positions behind war wagons, and when enemy knights charged, they would emerge wielding flails, war hammers, and other bludgeoning weapons specifically chosen to defeat armor. One account from the Battle of Kutna Hora in 1421 describes a Hussite warrior using a flail to kill 3 armored German knights in rapid succession. The weapon's chain allowed him to strike faster than they could recover from each blow, and the impact force of the spiked ball was sufficient to cause fatal injuries through their armor. But the flail had significant weaknesses that explain why it never became a standard military weapon. First, it required enormous space to use effectively. In the tight press of a shield wall or dense infantry formation, you couldn't swing a flail without hitting your own comrades. This made it primarily a dueling weapon or a tool for skirmishers fighting with space around them. Second, it was dangerous to the wielder. Miss your target, and the weighted head could swing back and strike you. Historical accounts and later period training manuals warn explicitly about this risk. A poorly controlled flail could break your own ribs, shatter your knee, or crack your skull just as easily as it could harm an enemy. Third, it was nearly impossible to train with safely. You can practice with a blunted sword or a padded polearm. You cannot safely practice with a chained weight swinging at combat speed. This meant warriors either trained with dangerous live weapons or went into battle with minimal practical experience. Despite these limitations, the flail maintained a psychological presence in medieval warfare that far exceeded its actual battlefield use. It became a symbol of peasant rebellion and righteous fury, the weapon of the common man striking back against armored nobility. This symbolic power appears repeatedly in medieval art, literature, and religious imagery. Yet as terrifying as the flail was in close combat, it was nothing compared to the next weapon, one that required not just strength, but a kind of reckless courage that bordered on insanity. Because this next weapon meant getting within arm's reach of your enemy and staying there. Weapon 4, the Maul, the Night Killer. If the bec de Corbin was a surgical tool for defeating armor, the Maul was a sledgehammer approach, literally. The Maul, also called the War Hammer or Great Hammer, was one of the simplest and yet most devastating weapons ever designed for medieval combat. Take a long handle, 4 to 6 feet in length. Attach to it a massive hammerhead of solid iron or steel, weighing anywhere from 5 to 15 pounds. The result is a weapon that could crush armor like an empty can. No finesse, no complex techniques, just raw, overwhelming force delivered to a single point. Historical records describe knights struck by mauls who remained standing for several seconds before collapsing, their armor intact but everything inside it destroyed. The weapon didn't cut, didn't pierce, it simply transmitted such tremendous force that the armor became irrelevant. Bones shattered, organs ruptured, skulls caved in. But what made the Maul truly fearsome was who wielded it, and the specific battlefield role they played. Maul-wielding warriors weren't typically part of the main battle line. They were specialists, often deployed specifically to counter the enemy's heaviest, most well-armored troops. When a wedge of plate-armored knights threatened to break through infantry lines, Maul warriors would be sent to meet them. The tactic was devastatingly simple. Let the knight come to you. His armor makes him confident. He expects your weapon to bounce off his steel plate. Then you swing a 10-pound hammerhead traveling at maximum force directly at his helmet, and his head snaps sideways inside his armor with bone-breaking force. He's dead before he hits the ground, and his armor doesn't have a scratch on it. Archaeological evidence from medieval battlefields tells a grim story that supports this brutal effectiveness. Mass graves from the Battle of Visby in 1361, one of the best-preserved medieval battle sites ever discovered, contain hundreds of remains, many still wearing their armor. Forensic analysis revealed something disturbing. A significant number of skulls showed catastrophic trauma, crushed, fragmented, or featuring massive depressive fractures, despite being found still enclosed in helmets. The helmets themselves were undamaged. The skulls inside were destroyed. This is the signature of a blunt force weapon like the Maul. The metal transmitted the impact directly to the bone beneath, and the bone couldn't withstand the force. Modern forensic recreations using period-accurate armor and replica mauls have confirmed that a strong blow to a helmeted head can cause fatal skull fractures without significantly damaging the helmet itself. But there's a specific technique for using the maul that historical fighting manuals reveal, and it's more sophisticated than you'd expect. German and Italian fencing masters of the 14th and 15th centuries, the same ones who taught sword and polearm techniques, also wrote about hammer weapons. Their instructions are surprisingly tactical. The maul wasn't just swung wildly. Effective use required understanding leverage, timing, and targeting. The weapon's length created tremendous leverage. A 6-foot handle with a 10-pound head at the end generates enormous force at impact, but it also makes the weapon slow and difficult to control. Historical manuals instruct wielders to use short, controlled swings rather than massive wind-up attacks, counterintuitive, but actually more effective. Why? Because on a medieval battlefield, you rarely had the space or time for a full baseball bat-style swing. Enemies were close, often grappling. The solution was to use the weapon almost like a thrust, driving the hammerhead forward in a straight line toward the target's head or chest, letting the weapon's weight do the work rather than relying on a wide arc. Contemporary accounts describe this technique in action. At the Battle of Agincourt, English knights who had dismounted to fight among the infantry used war hammers in exactly this way. Short, driving strikes to the head and upper body of French knights, dropping them in single blows. One account describes an English knight named John Cornwall, who reportedly killed 6 French knights in succession using a war hammer, never needing more than 1 strike per opponent. Another account mentions knights being struck so hard that their helmets were driven down into their shoulders. But the Maul had another, even darker use that chronicles from the period reluctantly acknowledge. It was the preferred execution weapon for captured knights when ransoming them wasn't an option. Unlike a sword, which might require multiple strikes to decapitate an armored opponent, or an axe, which could get stuck in armor or bone, the Maul could dispatch an armored prisoner with a single blow to the head. No mess, no struggle, no ceremony, just brutal efficiency. Records from the Italian wars of the early 16th century describe captured enemy commanders being executed by war hammer after battles. The weapon's use for execution was pragmatic. It was quick, certain, and required no special preparation of the prisoner. They could remain fully armored, kneeling or standing, and a single strike would end them. This practical brutality reflected the changing nature of medieval warfare. As the age of chivalry declined and warfare became more professional and ruthless, weapons like the Maul, which made no pretense of honor or skill, only raw effectiveness, became more common. Yet despite its devastating power, the Maul shared the same fatal weakness as many other heavy weapons. It was slow. Miss your first strike, and a faster opponent could close the distance and kill you before you recovered for a second swing. This made it a weapon for strong, confident warriors who trusted their ability to land that first, fight-ending blow. But even the mighty Maul seems almost refined compared to the next weapon on our list. One that was less a tool of war and more an expression of pure, unbridled aggression. This next weapon didn't kill with precision or technique. It killed through sheer, overwhelming violence that shocked even hardened medieval warriors. Weapon 5, the bardiche, the executioner's axe. Eastern Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries was a crucible of warfare. Ottoman invasions from the south, Mongol remnants from the east, and constant conflicts between European powers created a need for weapons that could match the ferocity of the combat. The bardiche was Russia and Eastern Europe's answer, an axe so large and so brutal that Western Europeans who encountered it were genuinely shocked. Picture a crescent-shaped blade, often 2 to 3 feet long and over a foot wide at its deepest point, mounted on a pole that could stretch 6 to 8 feet. The blade's edge ran along its entire length, creating not just a chopping weapon but a slicing one. This wasn't an axe in the Western sense. It was something between an axe, a polearm, and a sword mounted on a long handle. And it could sever a horse's leg with a single swing. The bardiche originated in Eastern Europe, particularly among Russian and Polish forces, sometime in the 14th century, but it reached its peak use during the 16th and 17th centuries among the Streltsy, Russia's first standing army and elite military force. The Streltsy were musketeers, but they carried bardiches as their melee weapons, and historical accounts make it clear these weren't just for show. When gunpowder smoke made muskets useless in close quarters, the bardiche became the weapon that kept these soldiers alive. But the weapon's design contained several features that reveal just how it was used in actual combat. First, the blade's curve. Unlike a straight axe blade, which delivers all its force at the point of contact, the bardiche's curved edge created a slicing action as it struck. This meant it could cut through flesh, bone, and even light armor rather than just crushing through it like a typical axe. The effect on an unarmored opponent was catastrophic. Limbs could be severed entirely, torsos nearly bisected. Second, the pole attachment. The bardiche's blade was affixed to the pole with metal straps that ran down a significant length of the handle, often 2 to 3 feet. This wasn't just decoration, it reinforced the entire weapon, preventing the blade from breaking off under the tremendous stress of combat. It also allowed the wielder to use the back of the pole as a brace, resting it against their foot or the ground to receive enemy charges. This bracing technique appears in contemporary illustrations and military manuals. A Streltsy soldier could plant the bardiche's pole against the ground, angled toward an approaching enemy, and the weapon would function almost like a static blade. Cavalry charging into it would impale themselves and their horses on its edge. Historical accounts from the Russo-Crimean Wars describe exactly this tactic being used against Tatar cavalry raiders. The Streltsy would fire a volley of musket shots, then immediately plant their bardiches and kneel behind them. Charging cavalry, unable to stop their momentum after the musket volley broke their formation, would crash into a forest of planted blades. Horses would be maimed or killed, riders thrown and then dispatched by follow-up strikes. But the bardish's most fearsome reputation came from its use in sieges and urban combat. The weapon's large blade made it exceptionally effective in confined spaces. While other polearms were too long and unwieldy in narrow fortress corridors or city streets, the bardiche could still be swung effectively in tighter quarters. Its cleaving power could break down doors, shatter wooden fortifications, and, according to several accounts, even chop through the shafts of enemy polearms. A chronicle from the Siege of Kazan in 1552 describes Russian streltsy using bardishes to literally hack their way through a wooden palisade, each warrior taking turns swinging at the same point until the timbers splintered. Once through, they used the same weapons to devastating effect in close combat with the defenders. The psychological impact of the weapon cannot be overstated. Western European accounts from diplomats and merchants visiting Russia in the 16th century frequently mention the bardiche, often describing it in terms of shock and awe. One English merchant, writing in 1588, described seeing streltsy soldiers practicing with bardishes and noted that they could cleave through a pig carcass as easily as a man might slice butter. But there's a darker aspect to the bardiche's history that connects it to its nickname, the executioner's axe. The weapon was indeed used for executions throughout Russia and Eastern Europe. Its large blade made for quick, clean beheadings, and its distinctive shape became associated with state power and justice. Public executions with bardishes were common, and the weapon became a symbol of the state's authority to take life. This dual nature, battlefield weapon and execution tool, wasn't unusual for the era, but the bardiche's particular effectiveness at both roles cemented its place in the cultural imagination. Even today, the bardiche appears in Russian military symbolism and heraldry, representing the historical power of Russian arms. However, like all specialized heavy weapons, the bardiche had significant limitations that ultimately led to its decline. It required tremendous upper body strength to wield effectively. A full power swing with a bardiche engaged the entire body, legs, hips, core, arms, and could leave a warrior exhausted after just a few minutes of intense combat. Historical training regimens for streltsy soldiers included specific exercises to build the strength necessary to use the weapon all day during extended battles. It was also less effective against heavily armored opponents. While it could certainly cause concussive damage through armor, and might break bones or cause internal injuries, it couldn't pierce plate armor reliably. This made it primarily a weapon for facing lightly armored or unarmored opponents, which, to be fair, described the vast majority of soldiers in Eastern European conflicts. As firearms became more dominant in the 17th and 18th centuries, and bayonets allowed muskets to serve as both ranged and melee weapons, specialized melee weapons like the bardiche fell out of regular military use. By the early 1700s, it had been relegated to ceremonial roles, though some units continued to carry them into the mid-18th century. Yet for all the devastating power we've seen in these weapons, the massive swords, the armor-crushing hammers, the limb-severing axes, none of them truly changed the nature of warfare itself. They were improvements, refinements, terrifying but ultimately part of the existing paradigm. The final weapon on our list is different. This weapon didn't just kill enemies. It killed the very concept of medieval warfare itself, and nothing would ever be the same. Weapon 6, the pike, the weapon that ended chivalry. For centuries, the mounted knight was the undisputed master of the European battlefield. Armored, trained from childhood, fighting from horseback, knights represented the pinnacle of military power. They were expensive to equip, difficult to train, and socially prestigious. A single knight could break through dozens of common foot soldiers. Then came the pike, and everything changed. The pike was, at its core, absurdly simple. A wooden shaft, 15 to 20 feet long, topped with a small steel point. That's it. No elaborate forging, no expensive materials, no years of training to understand. A peasant could learn to use a pike in weeks. Yet this simple weapon would bring an end to the age of knights and fundamentally transform European warfare. But the pike's power didn't come from the weapon itself. It came from how it was used, and that's where the genius appears. The pike phalanx, or pike square, was a formation of thousands of men, standing shoulder to shoulder in dense ranks, all holding their pikes at the same angle. The front ranks pointed their weapons forward, the rear ranks held theirs higher, creating a bristling wall of steel points that extended 15 feet in front of the formation. Nothing could break it. Not cavalry, not infantry, not even other pike formations without tremendous casualties. A mounted knight, the epitome of medieval military power, was helpless against a properly formed pike square. Charge the formation, and your horse would be impaled on multiple pike points long before you reached the men holding them. The horse, being a living creature with survival instincts, would refuse to charge into the wall of points, no matter how much the rider spurred it forward. This was revolutionary. For the first time, common foot soldiers with cheap weapons could reliably defeat armored nobility. The social and military implications were staggering. The Swiss mastered this tactic first, and they used it to devastating effect throughout the 15th century, establishing themselves as the most feared infantry in Europe. Swiss pike formations defeated the mounted knights of Burgundy, Austria, and France in battle after battle. The Battle of Nancy in 1477 saw Swiss pikemen completely destroy the army of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, one of the most powerful nobles in Europe. Charles himself was killed, his body found days later, stripped and half-eaten by wolves. But here's what made the pike truly revolutionary: it was democratic. A sword required years of training to use effectively. A warhorse cost as much as a village produced in a year. Plate armor required a skilled armor and months of work. But a pike? Cut down a straight tree, add an iron point, and you had a weapon. Give a man 2 months of drilling in formation, and he could hold his own against warriors who had trained since childhood. This meant that nations could field massive armies of pike-armed infantry at a fraction of the cost of traditional knightly forces. The Swiss famously fielded armies of 10,000 to 20,000 pikemen, dwarfing anything that could be assembled through the feudal system of knightly service. But the pike phalanx had a secret, a tactical innovation that made it even more devastating than its defensive capabilities suggest. The Swiss didn't just stand and receive charges. They attacked. Swiss pike columns would advance at a quick march, maintaining formation, and simply ram into enemy formations like a battering ram made of men and steel. The momentum of thousands of men pushing forward, all with their pikes leveled, was irresistible. Enemy formations would break and scatter before the Swiss even made contact. Contemporary accounts describe the psychological terror of facing an advancing Swiss pike column. The ground would shake from the synchronized footsteps of thousands of men. The air would fill with the sound of war drums and the war cries of the pikemen. Then you'd see the wall of pike points, gleaming in the sun, advancing toward you in perfect formation, unstoppable. Many formations broke and ran without fighting. Those that stood and fought were simply rolled over. The Battle of Marignano in 1515 saw Swiss pikemen hold their ground for 2 days against French forces that included artillery and firearms, a testament to both the effectiveness of the pike and the discipline of the men wielding it. But the weapon's very effectiveness contained the seeds of its own obsolescence, and the transition reveals the brutal mathematics of military evolution. Gunpowder changed everything. Again, early firearms were inaccurate and slow to reload, but they had one crucial advantage. They could kill a pikeman from a distance he couldn't respond to. A pike formation could stand against cavalry all day. It was helpless against musketeers who could stand 50 yards away and fire volley after volley into the dense ranks. The solution was to combine pikes and firearms. By the 16th century, armies fielded mixed formations. Pikemen to repel cavalry and hold the line, musketeers to provide firepower. This was the birth of modern combined arms warfare, and it would dominate European battlefields for the next 2 centuries. But the pike's time was running out. As firearms became more reliable and bayonets were invented, essentially turning a musket into a short pike, the need for dedicated pikemen disappeared. By the early 18th century, the pike had been completely phased out of European armies, replaced by muskets with bayonets. Yet the pike's legacy is profound. It democratized warfare, proving that disciplined common soldiers with simple weapons could defeat armored nobility. It encouraged the development of professional standing armies rather than feudal levies. It drove innovations in tactics, training, and military organization that shaped warfare for centuries to come. The pike didn't just end the age of knights, it ended the entire social system that supported them. When any farmer could be trained to defeat a knight in battle, the military justification for the nobility's social dominance crumbled. The pike, more than any other weapon, helped push Europe toward the modern era. And perhaps most importantly, it proved something that every subsequent military revolution has confirmed. In warfare, simplicity and numbers often triumph over sophistication and individual prowess. The pike was just a sharpened stick, but in the hands of thousands of disciplined soldiers, it changed the world. If you enjoyed this journey through history's most devastating weapons, hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to explore in the forgotten corners of military history.